Well, welcome everyone. So today we'll be talking about unlocking enterprise business potential with generative AI. So let's get going. So first we'll talk through an introduction to generative AI. We'll go through real world success stories, strategic implementation strategies, and future proofing your enterprise. I've been in the space for about 25 years, cloud computing, data science, etc. I'm the chief data officer here at Insight. And so I deal with data my entire career, my life. That's what it's all about. I also teach at Northeast University and do some work at MIT. And so I'm very interested in the space and love to talk to you more about it. All right, so let's look at the state of the market first. So if we look at the market, clearly generative AI adoption in the workplace is becoming a very popular interest, and certainly one area where we want to be able to focus. So productivity is the big thing that we are looking at today. There are other ways that it can be used, especially around automation, but if we look at today's activities or work activities, I know I personally use it myself, and many of folks within my organization, my teammates, also use it for productivity purposes. But half of today's work activities could be automated between 2030 and 2060 if we think about the application of some of these techniques. And we also know that automation has become sort of prolific over the course of the last decade. And so this is just the next generation of how we can start to think about automation. All right, of course, the hype. So back in November, when ChatGPT was initially released, everybody started using it. So it was one of the fastest growing applications in ever, actually. And so in this case, you can see just a lot of the different news articles that were talking about this phenomenon. And of course, it took the industry by storm. It also took all of us by storm. And I don't know anybody in my circle of contacts that has not heard of generative AI or ChatGPT. And clearly, it's becoming ubiquitous within our industry. And so we want to make sure that we understand it and how we can use it. I like to really talk a little bit about what was the evolution. So generative AI as a phenomenon has only been around since, let's just say, November, at least in terms of public awareness. But before that, artificial intelligence has been around since the 1950s. So it's been many, many decades that artificial intelligence has been around and we've been using it. Although current popularity of it is really just manifested itself with this generative AI concept and ChatGPT. But if you think about it, machine learning in the 1990s was another popular area of focus. We spent a lot of time thinking about machine learning and machine learning algorithms, and then deep learning around 2017 is when we saw deep learning start to take hold. And then in 2021, of course, generative AI becomes the popular approach. So just to kind of put things in a little bit of context. So what's really different about generative AI? Well, clearly it's bigger. Generative AI foundational models are trained on significant corpus of information. So broad patterns of the way that we speak and information is used to train the model. So that's really when we think about ChatGPT, for example, generative pre-trained transformer means that it's trained on a number of sources of information, and all of that data is pre-trained into the model itself. And then we use that model to be able to communicate with the model in order to generate human readable text, but also it can understand human text as well. And so this is really the significance. So in general, the models are trained on this broad pattern recognition model, which includes text on images, music, etc. So to create those patterns, as I said before, to understand human text or reason, and then also be able to generate it in a believable way. And I can even mention things like the Turing test. So the Turing test is really all about, can a machine produce content that is believable as human production? So this is in essence what we're talking about. And so we're moving in that direction. And as a matter of fact, the Google Brain team, Jeffrey Hinton, for example, they won the Turing Award, which was associated with the first version of a GPT model. And so that really is what it was all about. They're also fine-tunable. And so if we think about, well, maybe all the information that was stored in this pre-trained model is not what I need to run my business, or it knows nothing about my business. So we can fine tune it. And we'll talk about some of the different ways that you can fine tune the model in order to be able to customize it for your own needs. And the other thing that was really important most recently is accessibility. So I'll call it democratization of the model. So in general, using a chat-like interface allowed us to be able to interface or interact with the model conveniently. And then that ability to really conveniently access the power of the large language model and generative AI really made it accessible to everybody. And as like I said, democratized the capability. Okay, so what's so special about it? Well, in this particular case, we think about what are those productivity enhancement things that we would do in the past that we can now do much faster. So now if we think about before GPT and you wanted to either acquire some knowledge or you had to perform a specific task, you may actually need to first collect a set of information before you can start. So in this case, all that information would be accessible through maybe some databases, maybe some reports, maybe some of it was on the web, or maybe you didn't even know where to find it, so you needed to go and search for it. So in this case, we can look at GPT as being a great start. So if all of the information is available already in the pre-trained model, well, then all you really have to do is chat with the model. If it's not, then you can identify what that is and then present it to the model so that you can then use it for your integrated query or knowledge collection. So these are very valuable concepts for us, and you can see how it's going to increase our productivity significantly. Some of the primary use cases that I described, and the first one we just talked about was finding, but also there's also generating. And so not only do you want to find information and maybe educate yourself about it, which is the first use case here, so we can use enhanced natural language semantic search to locate information very easily, and we can also ask it questions. So it creates understanding for the person that's using the environment. We can also use it to summarize information. So vast amounts of information, you may in the past have had to do things like summarization manually or take notes in order to be able to summarize information. Now you can do it by using these generative techniques because the large language model is able to store all of this information as artifacts and then be able to summarize it for you in a human readable way, which is another huge benefit. And then also for generating, so creating new content based off of existing document formats or example patterns is something that it's really good at as well. So these are the three primary areas that we see today. Now, clearly there are ways to use generative AI in other use cases, but these are the ones we're seeing the most. And if you haven't had exposure to these, you might want to start taking a look at how you can use it in some of those ways. Now, I talked a little bit about this as well. What's the impact on the workplace? Well, productivity enhancement is clearly one of the biggest ways to see impact. So we can do more with less by automation, if you will, or the example I gave earlier, collecting information in order to be able to do something with it. So how many organizations say a vast production of sources of content across the organization that is inaccessible, or at least maybe if it is accessible, it's in a variety of different places, or even it could be the point where maybe it's not well curated. And so you may end up having to consolidate it and then be able to understand what it is that you actually have so that you can start to think about, well, what is the relevant information that I want to be able to use to allow us to be able to generate, say, additional content in similar patterns to what I maybe already have, or even use it as a mechanism for exploration where you can do a better job of curating your data sources. And it's very disruptive at the end of the day. So what this does is it allows us to be able to not necessarily, sort of circumvent the critical thinking part of what we do, but in general, it allows us to learn faster. So we can start to learn things more quickly. So you can ask questions about particular topic areas even within your own corporate corpus of information and understand things faster. So you can go through this very quickly. So it's disruptive to the learning process, number one. Also, it changes our business. So the business model can change because now we can do things faster and we can focus on things that might be more impactful or more future thinking. And so this is one way that we can think about disruption within not only within the industry, but also within our own organizations. And then for employees, it can impact the way the workforce evolves over time. So we may think about things like doing more. So resource shifting is one area where, because of the fact that these menial tasks, if you will, want to call them, or very manual tasks, will no longer have to be done. So now we can do other things with our time. We can become more insightful about what it is that we would want to do. And of course, incorporating automation just makes our life simpler. And the one thing that I always mention when I talk about employees is the fact that it also creates a better experience for employees. So imagine if you didn't have to do all that menial labor stuff that you were doing before. Now all of a sudden you're moving faster. You're able to get to the conclusion quicker or focus on the things that you really want to do. That increases your own satisfaction in your job. And so that's one that it's not really talked about too much, but one I see all the time. And so some stats here as well, 80% of jobs incorporate Gen AI technology and capabilities into their workforce activities. So this is something where we're going to start to see this over time. And then if we look at the number of jobs that could potentially be automated in some way, well, there's a lot of them. And so think about that as an opportunity, not just as a threat, but it's an opportunity to be able to do better. Some of the things that we've been seeing is, if we look at what is the innovation potential. So there's a lot of very specific use cases that we can think about: sales, marketing, finance, operations, IT, legal, HR. All of these can be impacted in some way. And I'm not going to read this entire slide to you, but think about some of the different areas. And it's sort of the state of art of the possible, if you will, to think about, well, can I use it for things like risk analysis? Absolutely. Because think about, what kinds of things would you want to do with risk analysis? Well, maybe I want to understand the rules or the regulations I might have in place, and then think about, well, where are the gaps? Or if it's an insurance organization, for example, well, then what kinds of policies do we maybe have? And then which ones could identify maybe risk or risk areas where we might say the policy doesn't cover particular areas, for example. So we can do document analysis to be able to help us with things like risk analysis, or legal briefs, understanding past legal briefs to be able to understand how we might say approach a legal case in the future. So there are plenty of different use cases that we've worked on as an organization, and then use cases that you've probably heard about or read about. And so think a little bit about these. And of course, it'd be remiss for me not to mention coding. Of course, we've all heard about coding. So this really is a productivity enhancer when you think about generating, creating code, or even learning patterns of code that might be more effective. So the Copilot model has been really helpful for coders as well. And as we were talking about up until this point, it's a productivity enhancer, and it helps us to be able to write code faster and then focus on delivering more effectively. So what's unique to generative AI, or what are some of the challenges that are unique to generative AI? Well, we have to think about things like prompt security. So how do we secure the information that we might be sharing with the model? So this is something where, if you use public domain, large language models, or chatting services, you do have to think about protecting that information. You also want to think about ownership. So the AI generated content may not be copyrightable without significant provable human intervention, and may infringe on copyrights of training data. So in this case, the jury's still out a little bit around things like copyright and ownership, but in general, think about what you're doing with that information. If you're generating content and it needs to be copyrighted, or at least authenticity needs to be proven, you may want to think twice about this a little bit, or at least understand what is being generated for you. Hallucinations is another big one. So hallucinations is really this issue of, when you ask the model a question, well, invariably it's going to give you an answer. Now, one thing that I like to also talk about is the fact that these are probabilistic models. So these the models in this case will return to you the highest probability response. It's a word-by-word generator, but it will give you a response, so long as it, of course, isn't some kind of a violation or inappropriate response or a question that was asked. But in general, it will always give you an answer. And so the highest probability answer might sound like a fake, quote unquote, fake answer, but that's what we call a hallucination. So the hallucination is like, well, wait, that doesn't make any sense to me, or it doesn't make semantic sense to me. So in that particular case, we call that a hallucination. So something to think about as well. And there are ways to measure for these kinds of things, and we're starting to see an evolution in the way that the models are created, but also the way that they respond, so that you can start to tell whether a hallucination is occurring or not. But that's just part of evolution. But it's invariable that you will see it. And then also disruption, of course. I've been talking about disruption just about this entire time. All right. So what are some of the shared challenges we think about? Well, security I just described. Compliance is another one. We're starting to see regulations come into the industry. So eventually we may be subjected to different types of compliance, which makes a lot of sense because I think we haven't really talked too much about what is the impact on society, or if you think about just the way that we operate. I know many people start talking about things like the singularity and general intelligence. So we have to also think a little bit about appropriate use and responsible AI use. So ultimately, compliance needs to come into play. And when we get there, we'll start talking about, well, what are some of the things that we would need to think about and apply them to the way that we create our solutions. And then bias is always something that's in play. So there's even bias in the pre-trained models that we think about today. So what are some of those bias, and how do you identify bias is another important part of this. This was true even of statistics before generative AI even came onto the market. So it's just something that we really do need to think about. If we're trusting machines to be able to do analysis for us, we also have to think about, well, was there any bias in the data itself? Transparency and trust is just really focusing on being able to explain and defend the things that we might be doing. Error and loss, inaccurate model outputs can also lead to direct or indirect financial loss potentially. So I'll go back to this garbage in, garbage out model. So if you have data that maybe is inaccurate, well, then you're going to get inaccurate results. And if you depend on those results without validation or checking, then yes, you may be subject to potential impact. So with respect to ML ops and responsible automation, in this case, we think about how to productionalize the environment. And so we can look at this from the perspective of, I have to manage and curate my data. I have to be able to understand how I'm generating responses. And so this area really just does focus on ensuring that we look at this in a very principled way. And then cost management, of course, we can look at it from the perspective of time, effort, and money required to build and maintain the model. So I like to talk about ROI. So we also think about, what is the return on investment? Are we doing the right things, and are we applying it in the most appropriate way? Okay, so we talk about also, when we polled a set of professionals, we look at, 51% are thinking about things like quality and control as concerns. So that's a significant number of people that are looking at quality and control. So some of the things that I've described here are ways to address that. All right. So risk mitigation with generative AI. So what are some of the ways that we can address the concerns that we've been describing? Private model instances is one way. So private tenant, or even to run it, maybe you run it on-prem without using the cloud. So someplace where you can control the data and access to the model. Also think about techniques for effective and responsible AI. I talked earlier about things like regulation, compliance. That's one way to think about it. Also, strong change in process management. I talked about things like operational and productionalization of the environment. So we may want to think about very structured process management techniques, ML ops and automation, as I described earlier. So those pipelines, but also those processes that are put in place. And then integrated cost and usage controls allows us to be able to monitor how much are we using, what are we using, are we paying for the right types of things. So that's important. So how can Insight help with generative AI? So we like to look at things in terms of adoption. So we start with an alignment. So basically, first, let's understand the overall environment. So we basically will start with a briefing. We'll talk about what are the kinds of things that you're looking to achieve as an organization. We'll talk about strategy within the organization. What are the use cases that you might be interested in terms of these are going to provide the most value for the organization? Then we look at ways to accelerate. How do we gain adoption quickly? So we produce a Lens for AI accelerator, for example, and that's one way for us to get up and running quickly. We also do AI ops for Copilot, so you can build them directly into your applications. And then Lens for Data Platforms Accelerator allows us to be able to get your data assets up to speed quickly so that you can create a ready for AI environment. Then we move into enterprise-wide transformation. So then we think about really scaling this up to the rest of the enterprise. How do you sort of take those use cases that you've created and then make them enterprise ready? And sort of moving into the environment where you can start to realize the actual benefit from everything that we've been describing or everything that you would have identified in the strategy workshop. And then finally, you get to the point where we can think about governance and management. So over time, I talked about productionalization. Now this is where we can actually roll out to production, understand how to look for things where we can improve or constantly improve the environment, and then also create center of excellence around AI, for example, which allows us to be able to drive the AI capabilities and the ROI across the organization and continue to do better. And that's where we really start to realize actual value. So we have a complete data and AI set of capabilities, and so across the board. So AI is not just generative AI. AI is a broad spectrum of capabilities, which includes even business intelligence, but it's all predicated on data. So if we think about the data platforms are a really critical component of it. It's sort of like the plumbing within a house. You can have the most beautiful black bathroom in the world with amazing fixtures, but unless the plumbing works, well, it's not going to be that nice. So in general, this is what it's all about. It's about the data platform and then taking advantage of that with generative AI or other AI techniques, and also analytics techniques like business intelligence or even reporting. So all of this comes together to create a productive environment for you to drive decision-making processes. And what's the real difference here at Insight? Well, we have a complete set of data and AI expertise and offerings, so we support any of those areas that I described. We have proprietary accelerators, which I've already talked about. So this is the lens for data platforms, lens for machine learning, lens for generative AI, and also an AI Center of Excellence accelerator, which I already described. And we are a full solutions integrator. So we can integrate across the entire organization from modern workplace to modern applications to OCM, intelligent edge, cybersecurity, et cetera. And we have partnerships with many of the cloud providers as well as on-prem providers and also automation providers. And so we have a broad spectrum of partners that we work with in order to create solutions to best support your needs. And then finally, when we start thinking a little bit about what are those areas of expertise, well, consulting services within specialty areas. And so our focus is in these primary areas, or I like to call them our areas of expertise around modern workplace, as I talked about, applications or infrastructure. Cybersecurity is a huge one, of course. We talked about securitization, data and AI, which is one of my favorites, of course, as well as intelligent edge. So how do you bring this intelligence out to the edge platform and then take advantage of these services and capabilities? And one of the unique things about Insight is that not only can we provide solutions with consulting services, but we also can deploy, support, manage the hardware, the software, the lifecycle services. And then we also support managed services. So we can take care of it after the fact. So if you're looking for managed services providers to be able to manage your solution overall, that's something we're really good at. And then of course, services, we're service strong. So we've been recognized across a number of different industry sources for our ability to be able to deliver. And we have presence in 6 continents and over 9,000 clients, 4 million seats under CSP management. So big, broad set of capabilities that we can help to create solutions within your organization. And if you're interested in taking the next step, we'll scan the QR code, and I'd love to hear from you. And thank you so much for your time.